On the morning of June 14, 1953, in Reno County, Kansas, a county extension agent named Dale Greer drove his tan Kansas extension pickup down the Hutchinson Road and stopped at the edge of Heinrich Voth's wheat field. He had driven past this field every spring for 7 years. He had stopped at it twice before, both times to repeat the same conversation, the same data, the same recommendation. He had never changed Heinrich's mind, and Heinrich had never changed his seed. But this morning, Dale was not stopping to recommend anything. He was stopping because he had spent the previous 3 days driving county roads and looking at wheat fields, and he needed to stand somewhere for a moment and understand what he was seeing. What he was seeing on field after field across Reno County was the worst stem rust epidemic in 40 years, reducing the 1953 Kansas wheat crop to a fraction of what it should have been. Stem rust is a fungal disease of wheat. It spreads by wind-borne spores. When it finds a susceptible variety, it moves through a field the way fire moves through dry grass, faster than anyone believes possible until they have watched it happen. The infected plants show brick-red pustules on the stems and leaves. The rust breaks open the plant's vascular system, stealing the carbohydrates meant for grain fill, leaving behind shriveled kernels and collapsed stalks. In a severely infected field, the yield loss can run to 70, 80, sometimes 100%. The plants simply do not make grain. Dale had recommended the Comanche variety to every wheat farmer in his district for 4 years. Comanche had better yield potential than the older varieties, better straw strength, better test weight. The variety trial data was clear. In a normal year, a farmer growing Comanche would put more bushels in his bin than a farmer growing the old turkey red that some of the older Mennonite families in Reno County were still planting. The numbers said switch. Dale had said switch. Most of his district had switched. Comanche had no resistance to the new race of stem rust that had come up from Texas in the spring of 1953. Neither did the other modern varieties Dale had been recommending. They were all falling. Turkey red was standing. Dale pulled over at Heinrich Voth's field and got out of his truck and stood at the fence line looking at wheat that should not be doing what it was doing. The turkey red was tall, taller than the modern varieties, taller stalks that the agronomists had called inefficient because they lodged in wind. The heads were full. The straw was amber gold in the June morning light. There was no rust visible, not a pustule on a single stem that Dale could see from the fence line. He stood there for a while. Then he drove to Heinrich's farmhouse. Let me tell you about Heinrich Voth, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he was protecting. Heinrich was 57 years old in the summer of 1953. He was the grandson of Jacob Voth, who had come to Reno County from the Molochna colony in southern Russia in 1874, with a group of Mennonite families who were among the first to bring turkey red wheat to Kansas. Before Jacob was his mother, Anna, who had pressed a cloth sack of seed wheat against her body under her coat on the immigrant ship because she had understood, crossing an ocean with nothing else, that the wheat was what mattered most of what she carried. Let me tell you about turkey red wheat, because it is the real beginning of this story. Turkey red was a landrace winter wheat that had been grown by Mennonite farmers in the Crimea and southern Russia for at least a century before the Kansas immigration. It was called turkey red for reasons that historians still debate, possibly because it came through Turkey on its way to Russia. possibly because of the color of the grain, possibly for other reasons entirely. What is not debated is what it was: a wheat variety that had been selected by Mennonite farmers across generations for the conditions of the Russian steppe. Cold winters, hot, dry summers, wind, and the specific disease pressures of a landscape that had been growing wheat since before written records began. The Mennonites who came to Kansas in 1874 brought their seed wheat the way people carry the most essential things, as close to the body as possible, as carefully as the crossing would allow. They knew what Kansas was. They had been told the winters were cold and the summers were hot and the wind never stopped. They recognized the landscape when they arrived. It reminded them of home. They planted what they had brought. Turkey red transformed Kansas agriculture. The wheat was hard winter wheat, suited to the Kansas climate in a way that the soft spring wheats being grown by earlier settlers were not. It established winter wheat as the dominant crop across the Great Plains. By 1900, Kansas was the largest wheat-producing state in the country, and Turkey red was the reason. Then the plant breeders went to work. Through the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, Kansas State College and the USDA developed new wheat varieties that out-yielded Turkey red in controlled trial plots. The new varieties were shorter, better straw strength, less lodging in wind. They matured faster. They tested heavier. In a good year, on good ground, with good weather, the numbers were real. A farmer growing the new varieties in the 1940s and early 1950s could expect 15 to 30% more bushels per acre than a farmer growing Turkey red. The extension agents fanned out across Kansas with the trial data and the recommendation. Switch. The future is here. Turkey red is the past. Most farmers switched. By 1950, Turkey red had largely disappeared from commercial production in Kansas. You could still find it on a few farms, mostly older Mennonite operations, where the family had been growing it since 1874, and where the argument for changing was not as simple as a yield number on a trial plot. Heinrich Voth's farm was one of them. Dale Greer had first visited Heinrich in 1946, the year Dale took the extension position in Reno County. He was enthusiastic the way young extension agents are enthusiastic when they believe they are carrying genuinely good news to people who need it. The Comanche variety was showing excellent results in the trial plots at Kansas State. Yield advantage of 22% over Turkey red on comparable ground. Dale had the numbers with him. He had spread them on Heinrich's kitchen table. Heinrich had looked at the numbers. He had looked at Dale. He had asked one question. What does Comanche do in a rust year? Dale had consulted his clipboard. Comanche shows good resistance to the prevalent races of stem rust in current Kansas production, he said. The trial data through 1945 shows no significant rust impact. Heinrich had nodded slowly. He had looked out the kitchen window at his Turkey red in the field beyond the barn. My great-grandmother carried that seed from Russia in 1874, he said. Her mother's mother grew it before her, back to when nobody in my family remembers not growing it. He paused. It has never had a rust year that took the crop. Dale had leaned forward, the way extension agents lean forward when they are about to make a point they believe is decisive. Mr. Voth, the current rust races in Kansas are well characterized. The modern breeding program accounts for them. Comanche is rated resistant to races 17 and 38, which are the primary races present in Kansas production. He tapped the trial data. These numbers represent the actual performance advantage you are leaving on the table every year you grow turkey red. Heinrich had looked at the numbers again. Then he had looked at Dale. "What races have not come yet?" he asked. Dale had not had an answer for that. He had said that the breeding program monitored emerging rust races and that variety recommendations were updated accordingly. Heinrich had thanked him for coming. He had offered him coffee. Dale had declined and driven back to Hutchinson. He had come back in 1949 with the same recommendation and a newer set of trial numbers. The conversation had been almost identical, including the question about rust races that hadn't come yet. Now it was June of 1953, and the rust that had not come yet had come, and Heinrich's turkey red was standing in it unchanged, and Dale was at the farmhouse door. Heinrich answered on the first knock. He looked at Dale, looked at the clipboard under Dale's arm, looked at Dale's face. He opened the door fully and stepped aside. "Come in," he said. They sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table, the same window, looking out at the turkey red beyond the barn. Dale set his clipboard down without opening it. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at Heinrich. "Your field looks good," he said. "It does," Heinrich said. Dale nodded. He looked out the window. "His own field in Section 14 is gone," he said. He meant the demonstration field the Extension Office maintained in the county to show farmers the recommended varieties in actual production conditions. Comanche. Completely rusted out. I walked it this morning before I came here. He paused. There is not a kernel in it. Heinrich looked at him. He waited. How is the turkey red doing this? Dale asked. He did not mean it as a challenge. He meant it as a genuine question from a man who needed to understand something he did not understand. Heinrich stood up. "Come with me," he said. They walked out to the field together. Heinrich led Dale to the edge of the wheat and crouched down, pulling a stem toward him. He showed Dale the base of the stem, the nodes, the leaf sheaths. No rust. He showed Dale the flag leaf. No rust. He straightened up and looked at the field around them, the full amber heads moving in the July wind, the straw strong and upright. "This rust came up from the south," Heinrich said. "Same wind that always brings it. His great-grandmother's family watched for it in Russia. They selected against it for 100 years before they came here." He looked at Dale. "Not against the race that is here, against the plant that gets sick when rust finds it." He paused. "You breed for yield in a good year. My family bred for survival in a bad one." Dale looked at the wheat. He was doing calculations that had nothing to do with yield numbers. He was calculating what 100 years of selection against disease susceptibility was worth against a 22% yield advantage in rust-free years. He was calculating how often a rust year came and what it cost when it did. He was calculating what it meant to ask a question that nobody in the variety development program had fully answered. What does this wheat do in a rust year nobody has seen yet? The answer was standing around him in the Kansas wind. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been shown the right question and missed it? Have you ever had someone hand you the exact answer to a problem that was coming and not recognized what they were handing you? Dale Greer had asked himself that question 7 years earlier in this same kitchen. He had asked Heinrich what Comanche did in a rust year. He had not been asking about Turkey Red's answer. He had been defending Comanche's known record against known races. Heinrich had asked him about races that hadn't come yet. Dale had not understood the question as a warning. He understood it now. Let me tell you about what happened in the summer of 1953 across Reno County, because the numbers are the story. The 1953 stem rust epidemic was caused by a new physiologic race of Puccinia graminis, the stem rust fungus, a race that had evolved in the southern wheat belt over the preceding few years and that the modern Kansas varieties had no resistance to. It moved north through Kansas on the prevailing southerly winds in May and June of 1953 and found in the Comanche and Ponca and Pawnee fields of Reno County a wheat population that had no answer for it. The Kansas wheat crop of 1953 averaged 9.4 bushels per acre statewide. In a normal year, it ran 25 to 30. In Reno County, the average was worse. Farms that had been yielding 28 and 30 bushels per acre the previous year came in at 6, 7, 8. Some fields were total losses. The hard winter wheat that was supposed to be the future of Kansas agriculture, the modern high-yielding varieties the Extension Service had been recommending for a decade, had been found by a pathogen that the breeding program had not prepared for. Heinrich Voth's Turkey Red came in at 22 bushels per acre. Not spectacular, not a record. 22 bushels was on the low end of what Turkey Red normally produced. The rust had found some susceptibility at the edges of the field where the wind deposited spores most heavily, and Heinrich had lost maybe 8% of his normal yield. But 22 bushels against a county average of something close to 7 was not a number that required much explanation. Heinrich took his grain to the elevator in Hutchinson on a Wednesday morning in late June. He pulled in with 3 wagon loads behind his farmel and waited in the line of trucks and wagons that stretched from the elevator approach back onto the county road. Dale Greer was at the elevator. He had come to document the harvest results for his district report, the kind of report that extension agents write when a year goes badly and the reasons need to be explained. He was standing near the scale house when Heinrich's wagons came in. He watched the scale operator weigh each load. He watched the moisture test. He did not speak to Heinrich until all 3 wagons had been unloaded and Heinrich was standing beside his farmel, making out the paperwork. 22 bushels, Dale said. 22 and a half, Heinrich said without looking up. Dale was quiet for a moment. He looked at his clipboard. He had numbers from the other farms in his district. He did not need to refer to them. He knew them. The family north of Heinrich on Section 12 had come in at 6.5. The operation west of them was a total loss. The demonstration field was 0. "I owe you an apology," Dale said. Heinrich kept writing. "I told you for 7 years that the yield data supported switching to Comanche." Dale looked at the farmel, the empty wagons, the grain receipt in Heinrich's hand. "I told you that the rust resistance data on Comanche was adequate." He paused. "I was working from the races we knew about." Heinrich looked up from the paperwork. He looked at Dale with his direct, pale blue eyes. "I know that. Your great-grandmother asked the right question," Dale said, "the one I could not answer, about the races that had not come." Heinrich folded the grain receipt and put it in his shirt pocket. "She did not ask questions about races," he said. She asked questions about plants. She selected the plant that survived when others did not. She did not know about races, and she did not need to. He looked at Dale. The plant that survives when others do not carry something. You do not need to know exactly what it carries to know it is worth keeping. Dale looked at the clipboard in his hands. He had spent 7 years in this county telling farmers what the trial data said. He was beginning to understand the difference between what trial data could measure and what it could not. "How much seed do you carry over each year?" Dale asked. "Enough for my acreage plus some," Heinrich said. "Same as always?" Dale looked at him. "Would you be willing to sell seed to your neighbors this fall?" Heinrich looked at Dale for a moment. He thought about the question. He thought about the families north and west of him who were looking at a grain receipt this summer that would not cover their input costs. He thought about what his great-grandmother had understood about seed when she pressed it against her body on an immigrant ship. "Tell them to come and talk to me," he said. "I will not sell it. I will share it." Dale looked at him. "Share it?" "They are my neighbors," Heinrich said. He looked at the elevator, the line of trucks with thin harvests. They had a bad year, and they need seed for next fall. He looked at Dale. "That is not something you sell. If you want to know what happened the following spring, how many Reno County farmers planted turkey red in the fall of 1953, and what the Extension Office said when the seed shortage made the national agricultural news, subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me if anyone in your family kept a crop variety that everyone else had abandoned. The answer to that question is larger than you might expect. By the time Heinrich finished making his decision at the Hutchinson elevator, word had already moved through Reno County the way word moves through farming communities in a bad year, fast, and with the specific urgency of people who need answers. The families who had lost their wheat crops needed seed for the fall planting. They needed it in 3 months. The elevator companies and seed dealers were scrambling to find rust-resistant varieties, but the supply chain for anything but the modern commercial varieties was not built for this kind of sudden reversal. Turkey red seed was available in Reno County in one place, Heinrich Voth's grain bins. 14 farm families came to Heinrich's place between July and September of 1953. He gave them each enough seed for their acreage. He kept enough for his own planting. He charged nothing. He spent 4 weekends showing each family how to clean the seed, how to grade it for planting quality, how to save a portion of the following year's harvest to maintain their own supply. He was doing what Anna had done in 1874 without being asked and without calculating the return. He was passing the seed on because the seed was what mattered and the people around him needed it. Dale Greer wrote a county extension report that fall that included a section on turkey red wheat and its apparent resistance to the 1953 rust epidemic. He submitted it to the Kansas State Extension Service. He did not expect much to come of it. He was wrong about that. The report reached a plant pathologist at Kansas State named Dr. Howard Bromfield, who had been studying the 1953 epidemic and who had been trying to understand why isolated fields across Kansas had shown resistance when the modern varieties had not. Bromfield drove to Reno County in October of 1953 and spent a day at Heinrich's farm sampling the turkey red and asking questions. He was direct about what he was looking for. The new rust race which plant pathologists had labeled race 15B, had specific virulence genes that allowed it to overcome the resistance genes in the modern varieties. Turkey Red's resistance appeared to operate through a different mechanism. Bromfield wanted to understand that mechanism so he could breed it into varieties that had Turkey Red's resistance but modern yield potential. He collected seed samples. He collected rust-infected plant material from the field edges where Heinrich's Turkey Red had shown partial susceptibility. He collected soil samples. He thanked Heinrich and drove back to Manhattan, Kansas. Heinrich went back to work. Let me tell you about the years after, because the consequences of 1953 ran longer than most people remember. The stem rust epidemic of 1953 was what plant pathologists call a wake-up call for the Kansas wheat breeding program. The race 15B outbreak demonstrated that genetic uniformity in a commercial crop, specifically the concentration of a small number of resistance genes in a large percentage of planted acreage, was a catastrophic vulnerability. When a new pathogen race evolved to overcome those genes, the failure was simultaneous and total across the entire landscape. The breeding programs responded by developing new rust-resistant varieties that incorporated resistance genes from multiple sources, including, after Bromfield's work, genes traced back to Turkey Red. The variety that Kansas State released in 1961, Wichita, carried rust resistance derived in part from the Turkey Red germplasm that Heinrich Voth had been maintaining on his farm in Reno County. Heinrich never knew this specifically. He knew the general story because Dale Greer told him in 1962, the year Dale retired from the Extension Service. Dale had driven out to the Voth farm one last time and told Heinrich what Bromfield's research had led to and what Turkey Red's genes had contributed to the new varieties. Heinrich listened to all of it. Then he said, "My great-grandmother did not bring that seed so that the universities could use it." He paused. "But I am glad they did." Dale looked at the Turkey Red still growing in Heinrich's fields, the same variety, the same seed lineage, unmixed and unchanged since Anna had pressed it against her body on the immigrant ship in 1874. "You are still growing it," Dale said. "I will always grow it," Heinrich said. Dale nodded. He looked at the wheat. "Even though the new varieties yield more?" Heinrich looked at the field. "What they did with my seed," he said, "is take what it knew and put it in something new." He paused. "But what it knows about surviving a bad year is not just the one gene they found. It is everything it learned in Russia across 100 years of bad years." He looked at Dale. "You cannot extract that from a laboratory. You have to keep the plant and keep selecting and keep watching what it does when the year goes wrong." He looked at Dale. "I will grow it until I am not able to grow it. Then my son will grow it." Dale drove back to Hutchinson for the last time. He retired that year after 16 years as the Reno County Extension Agent. He had recommended Turkey Red to exactly one farmer in his entire career in 1962, on the last day he was an agent, and that farmer had been growing it since before Dale was born. Let me tell you about 1970, because that is where this story closes. Heinrich Voth died in the spring of 1970 at the age of 74, in the farmhouse where he had been born, on the same ground his grandfather Jacob had broken out of Kansas prairie in 1874. His son Paul had been farming alongside him since 1958 and took over cleanly, The way farms transfer when there is nothing complicated in the paperwork, because there is no debt and the equipment is paid for, and the only question is who will walk the fields from now on. The turkey red was in the grain bins. Paul planted it that fall. He has planted it every fall since. The 1953 stem rust epidemic and its aftermath were documented in agricultural journals and university publications across the following decades. The story of the Mennonite families who had preserved turkey red and the role that preservation played in the breeding response became part of the history of Kansas wheat. It appeared in extension publications. It appeared in seed-saving literature. It appeared in academic papers about genetic diversity and crop resilience. What none of those publications mention by name, because the records do not survive in enough detail, is a woman named Anna Voth, who stood at a Kansas railroad depot in the fall of 1874 with one hand holding a child's hand and the other hand pressed against a cloth sack of seed wheat under her coat. She did not know about races 17 and 38 and 15B. She did not know about virulence genes and resistance mechanisms and the Kansas State Breeding Program. She knew about bad years. She knew about the years when the wheat failed and what it meant for a family when it did. She knew that the seed she was carrying had survived every bad year her family had lived through on the Russian steppe, and she carried it because she did not know what Kansas bad years would look like, and she intended to have something that had already survived things she could not foresee. That is not a breeding program. That is not a trial plot. That is a woman who understood, without any of the technical vocabulary, that genetic diversity is a hedge against the unknown, and that a plant which has survived 100 years of bad years carries something worth keeping, even if you cannot fully explain what it is. Heinrich understood this because Anna's daughter taught it to her daughter, who taught it to Jacob, who taught it to Heinrich's father, who taught it to Heinrich, not as a theory, as a practice, as the specific work of keeping the seed, selecting the heads, maintaining the lineage, saving enough for next year, and then a little more. Dale Greer understood it in June of 1953, standing in a Kansas wheat field that should have been dead and was not. The turkey red is still growing on the Voth farm. Paul's son grows it now. He sells a portion of his crop as heritage grain to a mill in Wichita that makes flour from it and sells it at a premium to bakeries that want the flavor and the history. The yield is still lower than the modern varieties. The straw is still taller. The maturity is still later. In a rust year, it still stands when the others do not. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the seeds carried across oceans and the women who pressed them against their bodies when they had nothing else worth keeping. Of the families who maintained what everyone else abandoned, not knowing specifically what they were maintaining, but understanding that a thing which had survived everything deserved the chance to survive whatever came next. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, did anyone in your family carry a seed, a variety, a crop, a plant across a border, or an ocean, or a generation? I want to know what it was and whether it is still growing. Anna Voth pressed that seed against her body in 1874 because she understood something that took the rest of Kansas until 1953 to learn. You do not know what bad year is coming. You keep what has already survived the ones you know about, and you trust it when the year comes to know what to do. The wheat knows. It has always known. You just have to keep planting it long enough to find out.